We are the group two, and our first topic is Asian regionalism. So, when talking about regionalism, the first thing that comes into our mind is when countries focus primarily on their own region rather than their entire country. Next is the cooperation between neighboring countries. And lastly, it helps the country to strengthen their shared regional culture, create the government stability, and create opportunity for the long run. Next is, why does regionalism matter? It matters because it boosts economic growth through stronger trade, investment, and local financial institution. It also promotes cooperation and understanding by sharing Asia's rich cultural and historical ties. And lastly, it encourages collaboration when it comes to goods, services, and ideas among neighboring countries. So what is the history of regionalism? It all started from the Silk Road, a vast network of land and sea trade routes that connected East Asia with the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, and maritime trade. Lastly, during the colonial era and Cold War, it caused divisions, but those struggles also shaped the push for unity and stronger regional ties we see today.
So in main goals, we have peace and stability. So through the cooperation between countries, peace and stability form. Strong communication in every country can manage shared challenges such as pandemics or global economic problems. Asian nations can respond more effectively and prevent conflicts. This teamwork builds trust, strengthens relationships, and reduces the risk of tension between countries. So the second one, economic growth and trade. One of the main goals of Asian regionalism is to make it easier for countries to trade goods and services. By lessening trade, restrictions, and improving cooperation between countries, it helps the market develop and adopt the changes, especially during global pandemics. Additionally, it also creates new opportunities for the economies of the countries and ensures that every country have benefits from the shared growth. Overall, the countries across Asia are more connected and have better economic systems because of Asian regionalism. So, challenges. So, the first one, we have political differences and conflicts. So, political differences and conflicts are among the biggest challenges of Asian regionalism. While the vision is unity and cooperation, disputes over territory, varying political systems, and clashing national interests often slow down the progress. So the second one is the economic gaps between rich and poor countries. The economic gaps between rich and poor countries weaken Asian regionalism by creating unequal benefits and slowing down integration. For regionalism to succeed, there must be a fair distribution of opportunities and stronger support for developing nations so that no country is left behind. So the last one, nationalism and lack of trust. So nationalism and the lack of trust are major obstacles in Asian regionalism because they prevent countries from fully committing to shared goals. For journalism to succeed, nations must learn to balance their national interest with collective good and build stronger trust through dialogue, transparency, and cooperation. So the future of Asian regionalism, we have youth and education exchange. So youth and education exchange serve as a bridge in Asian regionalism, connecting people, enhancing mutual understanding, and equipping the next generation with the skills and solidarity to sustain a more integrated, peaceful, and progressive Asia. The second one, intra-regional trade growth. So intra-regional trade growth in Asia means that Asian countries are trading more goods and services with each other, creating stronger economic ties with the region. This growth is driven by free trade agreements, regional supply chains, and rising consumer demand in Asia. So the last one, stronger regional identity and unity. Asian regionalism is not just about economics or politics. It's also about building a shared identity among nations. By encouraging cooperation through culture, education, youth, and dialogue, Asian countries are slowly shaping a collective sense of belonging.
Now, after the future of Asian regionalism, let's now proceed to the advantages of Asian regionalism. First, the economic growth and trade. It encourages free trade agreements, reduces shipping fee costs of items, and improves investment opportunities. The biggest example that I could give for economic growth in trade is the Association of Southeast Asian Nation, also known as ASEAN. It is a organization that helps developing countries to develop furthermore and be able to keep up with the already developed nations. Now the second one, political cooperation. It promotes dialogue and peaceful resolution of conflict, reducing reducing tensions between neighboring countries. It avoids the it avoids it avoids to tawag doon sa term. It avoids unequal development among the other countries because it lessens the tension between the countries that we are not allied with. That's why political cooperation is an advantage of Asian regionalism. Now, the bargaining power. When united, Asian countries have a stronger voice in global affairs, balancing against Western powers. The fourth one is the shared development goals. It also promotes regional infrastructure projects and environmental protection and disaster response cooperation. Now let's go to the disadvantages of Asian regionalism. The first one in disadvantages of Asian regionalism is unequal development. Wealthy countries benefit more than poorer ones, widening inequality. The second one is the conflicting interest. It shows the different political systems, perspectives, and national priorities can hide their operation. The third one, sovereignty concerns. Some nations fear losing independence when they commit to regional agreements. The fourth one is too reliant on larger economies. Now, in conclusion, a future for a unified and progressive region. Economic ties and cultural exchange fosters regional unity. It also cooperates on shared challenges that builds peace and stability. A united So, in my own words, I think that Asian regionalism is a great help for the South for the Asian countries because it helps us communicate more with each other, and we are going to be able to solve the challenges that we are going to face in the near future with a more allied and with a more unified country.
So that's it for Asian regionalism.
Before we start, let me ask you a question. Can we still call it a prospering global community if others are getting left behind? Good day. Today we'll be presenting the topic, the global divide, the North and the South. What exactly is the global divide? It refers to a division from countries that are considered economically wealthy and countries that are considered poor and developing. This is not only limited to economic disparities, but also technological and resources gaps found in between these regions. These regions are classified as the global north, the wealthy region, and the global south, the poor and the developing region.
Now, let's talk about how the world is split into two major categories, the global north and the global south. Let's start with the global north. This refers to developed, industrialized, and wealthier nations. Most of them are found in the northern hemisphere, and examples include the United States, Canada, Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom. The countries I mentioned are known for having high gross domestic product or GDP, which means they produce a lot of goods and services. They also have advanced technology, strong infrastructure, and overall higher living standards compared to other parts of the world. On the other hand, the Global South refers to developing or less economically advanced nations. They are mostly located in the southern hemisphere, but not exclusively. Some examples are the Philippines, India, Nigeria, and Brazil. Compared to the Global North countries, Global South countries usually have lower GDP and economies that are still emerging. They also have limited access to resources and technology, and larger populations often face inequality. So if we compare them side by side, the global north has high GDP, advanced technology, and higher living standards. Meanwhile, the global south is still developing, has limited access to technology, and living standards are often lower and uneven. Now that we've seen the differences between the global north and global south, let's go back in history and find out how this divide actually started, especially after World War II.
Hello, everyone. So now we will talk about the essential context for how we came to understand the world as divided between a wealthy North and a developing South. After World War II has ended, the world didn't split into two parts, but it instead split into three. According to Patterson from his 2023 encyclopedia titled The Three Worlds, the first and second worlds were defined by the Cold War struggle between capitalism and communism. The third world was a political term for the non-aligned countries during the war since they are often newly independent countries who were caught in the middle of the crossfire. However, it is crucial to remember that third world did not originally mean poor. It meant not taking a side in that global ideological battle. Now let's move on to the post-Cold War history. Everything changed with the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union dissolved, and the term Second World vanished. Even though the old political labels no longer fit, there is still the economic realities that did align with the terms. The gap between the rich, industrialized nations and the poorer, developing ones was more obvious than ever. This is when the terminology evolved into the global north, the global south. This isn't a perfect geographical split. For example, Australia is in the south, but it's north in socioeconomic terms. It describes a divide in wealth, power, and development. But what exactly creates this divide? The next person will answer and explain this question.
This global division is not just about geography. The divide is really about inequalities and differences across five main areas, and that includes the economy, culture, security, politics, and technology. In terms of economy, the global north has advanced industries and modern infrastructure. Meanwhile, the global south often relies on agriculture and raw materials, which makes their economies less stable. The North also enjoys higher GDP, stronger currencies, and better job opportunities. But in the South, we see lower GDP, weaker currencies, higher unemployment, and poverty rates. Security is another dividing line. The global north has strong military power, such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or most commonly known as NATO, and nuclear capabilities. But many countries in the south face internal conflicts, terrorism, or weak governance. The north also has more stable political systems and stronger governance, while the south often relies on foreign aid for peacekeeping and disaster. When it comes to culture, the global north has more exposure to education, media, and technology. The south, on the other hand, is rich in traditional cultures, but they are less represented globally. The north also dominates global influence, but the south struggles to preserve indigenous practices while facing modernization pressures. In terms of the technology gap, the global north leads in artificial intelligence, medicine, and innovation. But the South faces a digital divide because of limited internet connectivity and slower adoption of new technologies. Politically, the global North dominates decision-making bodies like the United Nations, World Bank, and International Monetary Fund or IMF. Despite having a larger share of the world's population, the global South has less voice in these global institutions. So now that we've seen how the North and South are divided in many aspects, let's zoom into a specific region, which is the ASEAN countries, and see how these challenges and opportunities play out in their context.
Let us now move on to discussing a case study by author Soo-hyun Lee. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, is a regional group that aims to address economic and security issues among the 10 Southeast Asian states it comprises. The article by Soo-hyun Lee examines how ASEAN's idea of economic security has evolved, focusing on regional economic initiatives like trade agreements and the ASEAN Economic Community. It argues that ASEAN could further strengthen economic security by proving its commitment to regional economic cooperation, improving weak institutions, resolving domestic political conflicts, and addressing unexpected challenges due to external factors like the US-China rivalry and the COVID-19 pandemic. Let us move on to the achievements and contributions of the article. By building regional economic institutions and trade agreements, ASEAN has enhanced economic cooperation, security, growth, and development among its members, as well as reduced the risk of interstate conflicts. However, ASEAN arguably relies heavily on voluntary cooperation and informality, and could further improve economic growth with regional security by focusing more on formal institutions with binding obligations. External challenges such as the US-China rivalry and the pandemic are reshaping ASEAN's economic security, making systemic and institutional reforms and cooperation of the member nations important for continuous stability and development. Now, for the benefits of the article, it effectively highlights ASEAN as one of the few successful cases of regionalism in the developing world. It discusses how ASEAN built trade agreements and the ASEAN Economic Community, demonstrating how trade and the cooperation among member nations reduced interstate conflicts. The discussions on how ASEAN's economic security is being affected by external factors also proves the article's relevance to current challenges. It suggests ways that ASEAN can further enhance its economic security, including moving away from voluntary cooperation and building stronger institutions. Finally, the limitations of the article. While it underlines external challenges like the US-China rivalry and the COVID-19 pandemic that reshape ASEAN's economic security, it isn't able to explore other global forces such as climate change and the scarcity of resources. Another limitation can also be seen in the regional scope, which focuses primarily on Southeast Asia, failing to wholly connect ASEAN's experience in global inequalities. Let us now move on to contemporary challenges that especially illustrate the differences between the global south and the global north, starting with the COVID-19 pandemic. After 2 years in the COVID-19 pandemic, the global north is able to ease domestic restrictions, such as getting vaccinations, social distancing, and wearing face masks, and access resources, and policy innovations to battle the most harmful effects of the pandemic, while the global south is hit hard by the crisis. Some countries in the south have been set back in their progress on poverty, healthcare, and education. The pandemic also posed challenges in the global south that were as daunting, if not more so, as those faced in the more industrialized global north. These challenges involved weak public health systems, lower living standards, and a lack of services in cities and rural locations in the global south. Other challenges include climate vulnerability, debt crisis, and technological dependency. Poorer countries are more susceptible to damage produced by climate change. Initial inequality in the countries of the global south also makes them more disadvantaged and vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Additionally, 55% of the countries in the global south are in precarious debt crisis, resulting in a lack of financial resources that are needed to combat poverty, hunger, and climate change. And finally, in the context of technological dependency, technology transfer mainly benefits core countries, protecting their interests and leaving other developing countries dependent. Dependency scholars also argue that it is too expensive for developing countries to develop and improve their own technologies.
Now to summarize our presentation. Our analysis today reveals a clear and persistent truth. The North-South divide is not a relic of the past, but a powerful framework defining a modern, global inequality. It's a fundamental split in wealth, technology, security, and political influence. Furthermore, our deep dive into ASEAN showed that regional cooperation is a crucial tool for the global south, but it's extremely hampered by internal weaknesses and overwhelming external pressures, like the US and China rivalry. And as we saw, global challenges for pandemics to climate change are not felt equally. They act as threat multipliers, disproportionately harming the South and deepening the divide. Now, this brings us to the most important question, one that moves beyond analysis and into part of our own responsibility. As future leaders and empowered citizens, do we perpetuate this system of global inequality, or do we work to dismantle it? As the generation of professionals, voters, and global citizens soon to enter this landscape, this is the defining challenge we will inherit. The question is no longer just what the divide is, but what we will do about it. The answer will depend on the choices we make in our careers, our policies, and our collective demand for a more equitable future. That is all. Thank you for listening.
What is market integration? Market integration happens when separate markets start acting as one. Prices and information flow easily, making trade faster and more efficient. It reduces waste because goods move where they are needed most. Both producers and consumers benefit from smoother transactions. In short, it's the unification of markets into a single system. There are three main types of market integration. First is horizontal integration is when similar businesses combine to strengthen their position. Second, vertical integration connects the supply chain from production to distribution. Last is conglomerate integration, joins unrelated businesses under one management. All of these makes operation bigger and markets more connected. Importance of market integration. Market integration makes economies more efficient and competitive. It gives consumers more choices at lower prices. Businesses also gain wider opportunities to grow and expand. It helps strengthen cooperation among regions and countries. Still, it must be managed well to avoid risk and uneven benefits.
International financial institutions, or IFIs, plays a major role in sustaining the global economy. They provide funding, technical support, and financial stability to countries in need. They are divided into public and private institutions. Here we have public IFIs, which are the World Bank Group, International Monetary Fund, and the Asian Development Bank. The World Bank Group loans and grants to developing countries for infrastructure, poverty reduction, and education. The IMF ensures financial stability and provides emergency loans when a country's economy is in crisis. And for the ADB, they are based in Manila and they focus more on Asia Pacific development projects. For private IFIs, which are Citi and Merrill Lynch, these are investment banks that provide funding for corporations and help in global capital markets. Unlike public FCIs, they focus more on profit and private investments. So basically, these institutions are like the backbone of global financial support, in which public FCIs focuses on development and stability, while private FCIs push investment and business growth. Another important driver of market integration is global corporations. These companies connect different countries by producing, investing, and selling across borders. They are inseparable from globalization because they make goods, services, and even culture flow worldwide. Global corporations also operate at different scales. We have global companies, MNCs, and ZNCs. For global companies, they have the same product worldwide, but they adjust their product for the local markets. And for MNCs or multinational corporations, they have operations in many countries, but their decisions are decentralized. And for TNCs or transnational corporations, they are fully integrated worldwide and they have no real home base. For example, the company Nestle, they operate as if the world is one market. They source and produce everywhere. These corporations drive globalization because they connect producers, workers, and consumers across different nations. The way they operate impacts jobs, trade, and even culture. And to make market integration more relatable, let's look at the Philippine context. The Philippines experiences globalization through trade agreements, imports, remittances, and even our daily use of online platforms. For example, we have ASEAN trade agreements, rice imports, OFW remittances, and online shopping. For ASEAN trade agreements, the PH benefits from lower tariffs and free trade with ASEAN neighbors. Next, rice imports, where the Philippines imports rice mainly from Vietnam and Thailand, and it shows how dependent we are on global trade for food security. And for OFW remittances, and where billions of dollars come into the PH yearly, and those remittances stabilize the peso and boost household consumption. And lastly, online shopping. We have platforms like Lazada, Shopee, Amazon, and even TikTok Shop, which bring in global products. And even small businesses in the Philippines can now sell abroad through these platforms. So in the Philippine context, market integration isn't just about big corporations. It's also about how everyday Filipinos experience global trade, whether it's through the rice we eat, money our OFW send home, or the items we buy online.
When we talk about market integration, it's not all smooth sailing. There are some key challenges we need to consider. One, local versus foreign business struggle. Local businesses often face tough competition from bigger foreign firms, which can limit their growth and market share. Two, import dependency. Countries may become overly dependent on imported goods, which can affect local industries and make economies vulnerable. Three, inequality. Market integration can increase inequality as benefits might go more to large corporations or wealthier sectors rather than everyone equally. For environmental risk, expanding market can lead to overexploitation of natural resource and environmental degradation if not managed responsibly. These challenges show that while integration brings opportunities, it also requires careful planning and regulation. Attributes of global corporation. Global corporations are major player in market integration, and they come with both positive and negative attributes. One, drives development but also inequality. They bring investment and innovation, but their influence can widen the gap between the rich and the poor. Number two, influence environment, labor, and sovereignty. Their operations can, uh, can affect local labor standards, environmental policies, and even national decision making. Number three, can destabilize economies during crisis. Larger corporations can sometimes pull out investments quickly, causing economic instability. And lastly, influential in shaping policies. They have the power to lobby and influence economic and trade policies to favor their interests. Understanding these attributes help us see why global corporations are both an opportunity and a challenge in market integration. To wrap it up, market integration is a mix of opportunities and challenges. It connects worldwide, allowing businesses and consumers to benefit from global trade. It's fueled by international laws and global corporations that shape how markets operate. It brings growth and opportunities for innovation, investment, and access to products. But the challenges require balance, so we need careful regulation, local support, and sustainable practices. In short, market integration is a powerful tool, but like any tool, it works best when used responsibly.